Hello YouTube. Today I have a 2011 Subaru Impreza WRX with a spinning encapsulated nut for the front lower control arm. After I figured out what the issue was, I first assumed that my lower control arm bushings were shot, as when I was driving down the highway I would get a clicking noise whenever I suddenly tapped the brakes. When I was hard on the brakes on the highway, my car would steer ever so slightly to the right, and sometimes I noticed that the little clicking noise would occur when I went over a speed bump. Anyways, I assumed it was a routine bushing job, but unfortunately, as I was removing the control arm, I figured out after removing the stud bolt, this stud bolt goes into the frame, screws to a welded encapsulated nut in the frame, and this is how the rear bushing for the front lower control arm is mounted. Anyways, I was fortunate enough that somehow the stud bolt came loose, but after putting my finger into the hole right beside the downpipe, that was replicating the sound that was bothering me. It is the second hole. There's two holes, two bolts holes. Sure, let me get a better angle for that. And then there's the top hole beside the downpipe that you're able to stick your finger into, and that nut and its welds are broken. Searching on the internet, there was a guy with a Forester that had the same exact issue, except he cross-threaded the nut and broke the welds. After learning about the encapsulated nut welds being broken, my first impression was to pull out the passenger seat, lift up the carpets, and right here beneath the floor, the carpets, sits the ECU. The ECU has this guard, just sheet metal, tin metal, that covers the ECU that bolts to this stud and a stud over there. I had a rough time pulling out the cover, as for some reason it had non-serviceable nuts, or I can't describe it, but I actually had to pull out this rivet from the firewall. Anyways, I'll fix that later. Once I had access to the floor pan, I had my dad push a screwdriver into the hole and tap on the firewall. Right here beside the Sharpie marks, I'll get to that later, this is where I roughly thought this scratch where the nut sat against the firewall. Cue to 1 week later, I was able to get to a parts car, and it should be on screen right now. I cut into the floorboards and was able to find where the nut was. Fortunately, it was actually, my estimate was pretty close, and after measuring out roughly where the nut sat, if you take any other measuring tape, you use this bottom stud right here to measure ever so slightly over 5 inches, you're able to roughly get on the left hand side here, and then go across 1 more inch in. You put a ruler up here, and roughly above this insulation, the sound insulation, this is past the Sharpie lines, this will be the metal frame, and here there's a lot more space that I'll probably have to cut out in order to have extra space, but roughly right around here is where the nut sits if you were to cut past this firewall. So after reviewing some of my images that I had the measurements on, I decided to extend the line over 1/2 inch. So if I take my measuring tape and measure a little bit over 5.5 inches, I'm able to get in line with the mark up above. This gives me a little bit more space near the frame on the left hand side, and I put a Sharpie mark on this side because the seam sealer right here is roughly around where the frame is. Then at the top, I had to put a mark up there and on the bottom, but depending on how much more room I'm going to need, I'll decide to either cut further down or further up. I removed the glove box as it gave me some more headroom, but it's a pretty tight squeeze, so hopefully I can get an angle grinder in here, or I might use some air power tools, depending if that works. Well, here we go. I just cut out my little rectangle, and there is the moving nut. I'm even able to pick it up, everything. My next problem solved is trying to figure out how to get this nut out, because it seems like it has a little flare or an ear that doesn't let me go through the hole. But as you see, there is the left side of the frame. There is the right side. The right side, judging by my thumb, you can cut out maybe another 1/2 inch, less than that. The whole bottom cavity in there is free, so if you need to cut all the way down to here, you're more than able to. And likewise on the front side, if you need to. But bear with me as I figure out a way how to get that spinning nut out of the hole. Alrighty, I was able to get the nut out. It has a pretty large washer on it. It was a pain trying to get it out. It's not pretty, but I finally got it out. So I used just an array of drill bits to enlarge the hole to the point I was able to use this step bit to make it pretty large. I had to do multiple holes. So I first started on the right side, then the left side to see if I could slip it out that way. I couldn't, so I started enlarging on the bottom, and I was finally able to kind of go at an angle to slip it in as shown. Jiggle it out, fits right in. Okay, it has been roughly around 1.5 to 2 hours, taking my time, making a hole substantially larger so that I could fit a wrench and nut in there when I attempt to put this back together. But as I was looking at the nut, I took some brake part cleaner to see, and it doesn't really appear to have any welds. I'm not really quite sure. There's a little bit of surface rust as the nut was moving around, and I imagine moisture got in there. But anyways, I put some brake part cleaner, cleaned off the old undercoating, and I'll probably put some fluid film in here once I start putting it back together. But I've been using very old drill bits that have been dull, so that's why it's taken quite a long time, but I believe this should be good. So after some thought, this is my plan. I will be using new hardware, but I'm planning on doing first a dry fit with the old hardware, as the new hardware has already Loctite and stretch threads on it. Over here is the new hardware. Here is the part number for the stud and its corresponding nut right there. Then over here is the other bolt for the other bushing and its corresponding nut. Then over here is 2 bolts. These bolts are the ones that mount to the frame that hold in that bracket. I'm planning on using these M14 by 1.5 pitch nuts, as they have a thicker wall compared to new Subaru ones. And I'm planning on stacking these nuts on top of each other, and I like the security of that. So I'll first put the spacer on the outside of the car. Then you can imagine the frame right here. I'm going to be using galvanized washers. They're roughly the same diameter as the encapsulated nut, and I'm planning on doubling them up as the encapsulated nut is quite thick. Then I'll put on the first nut. I'll thread that down till it's snug. Then I'll get a person to hold, I believe these are 22mm. I'll put a 22mm wrench on the top. At the same time, I'll jam nut these 2 nuts together on the outside of the car, and I'll be able to then torque the stud to 81 foot-pounds as per Subaru spec. You can use a 15mm extra deep socket, but I currently don't have one. And as I was looking on the Subaru manual, they do call it a special tool, but I imagine you can order one in and see if that works. So that is my plan. See what happens. I forgot to mention this. These are the 2 bolt holes, and this is the hole where the stud goes into. If you see, it actually is egg-shaped. So I'm planning on using the control arm or that bracket that mounts to the rear bushing as the guide for the stud. Alrighty, I'm on the ground right now, and after dry fitting the control arm, I had the control arm all the way up here. I thought it was actually better off using this bracket, as it was crucial for these two bolt holes to be lined up. I noticed when I had the control arm on and I tried to put this bracket under it, it was aligned like this. So I think it's better off to use bolts to these bolt holes to align the stud properly in the car. So already I got the stud torqued. I basically used two nuts against each other. So I used an open on the top end and then put a socket on the bottom end in order to tighten them against each other. This was more or less what a double nut is. Before that though, I used the bracket. I mounted it above the nuts. So that I could have an alignment of the stud. So I just snugged the bolt holes together so that the stud was correctly aligned. I then snugged it with the 15mm on the stud just to make it tight. I took the bracket off, then double nutted the stud and torqued it down to, I believe, 65 foot-pounds I was able to do before the nuts started to spin. Alrighty, this is what the top looks like. I put a little bit of anti-seize under the washers, but the whole entire stud has been red Loctited. So I won't have any issues of this stud moving around. I'm going to now put another nut on top of it to further stretch the stud. Sorry for the time skip, but I have the whole lower control arm installed. So the center nut for the stud, Subaru called for 81 foot-pounds, but because I put anti-seize on the threads, I put a 25% reduction. So that was torqued to 61, roughly around there. Then the two bolts all have anti-seize. Subaru calls for 111 foot-pounds, but I put those to 85. Then the ball joint, Subaru calls for I believe around 30-ish, so I put it down to like 25, around there. Then I'll have to wait till the car is put on the ground in order to put that lateral bushing torque spec, as the car needs to be level and the suspension compressed so that the bushing does not prematurely wear. But that is all. In the inside, I decided to use a Subaru nut on top of the nut that I put on the bottom. I would have preferred using the Subaru nut as it is locking on the bottom. However, the walls are quite thin and I didn't feel comfortable putting all that compression if I were to put another nut on top of it. Although I still have Loctite on the top nut, and as I was torquing the lower nut for the control arm, the stud didn't move at all, so that is a good sign. Before I drive the car, I'm going to wait 24 hours to let the red Loctite cure, but by then, everything should be buttoned up and good to go. Okay, I have the car onto some ramps, and I just torqued this bushing to 70 foot-pounds, but because I have anti-seize on it, I reduced it down to 53 foot-pounds. As I was backing out of the garage, I wasn't hearing any clicking noise, but in a couple hours, once the red Loctite is fully cured, I will go for a drive. Sorry for the time jump, but after driving the car, I went and got it aligned. To my surprise, the front suspension was in spec and needed no adjustment. After this, I continued driving the car for a couple thousand kilometers without any issues. Once I felt confident that the stud bolt was not moving, I cut out a new cover for the hole that I put on and used 3M seam sealer on it. I bought this from Amazon, and at least in Canada and North America, I can easily buy it. After this, I put the interior back in and continued driving the car for now 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers without any issues. A little over a couple weeks ago, I got another alignment on the vehicle, and it was in spec without having any need for adjustments. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and hope this can help anyone else plagued with this issue. I know there's at least the Imprezas, the Foresters, Outbacks, and maybe other numerous models of Subaru during this year, and I saw nothing on forums or anything that gave any insightful help. So thank you for watching and have a good rest of your day.